Hello, and welcome to the Was and Will podcast. Here we follow the journeys of immigrants and their success stories, their highs and lows, who they were, who they are, and who they aspire to become. So today we have a very special guest, Ms. Mellany Han. So, Ms. Han, thank you for coming. And would you like to first introduce yourself?
Hello everyone. My name is Mellany Han. I'm an LA County native, shout out 66. I've been teaching in the K through 12 education space for the last 8 years, and currently I'm studying education leadership and entrepreneurship at Harvard University.
Thank you for that introduction. Okay, so now let's start with the was of who you are. Can you tell us a bit about your background?
My story, like many with immigrant families, it stands on the shoulders of my parents who immigrated to California in their early 20s in the 1900s. During that time, like many of our parents, they experienced layers of hardships, including financial instability and racism. So, when my younger brother and I came into the picture, the accumulated trauma tore my parents' marriage apart. That meant that most of my childhood, I lived with a single father, and he worked really, really hard to get me and my younger brother into the best school district possible. I think that was kind of his MO in parenting. And we moved from district to district. I moved to a total of 4 different elementary schools until we finally settled in Arcadia, California, known for its Blue Ribbon School District. That's where I went to high school. I went to undergrad at Boston University and studied English Lit. From there, I taught in rural Korea for 2 years, discovered my passion for teaching, came back, and I've been teaching in Oakland ever since.
Thank you. So, as a child of Asian immigrant parents, did you ever feel any pressure to become something more stereotypical for Asian Americans, like a doctor or a lawyer?
Yeah, I definitely felt that pressure. I had one parent, my father, he was very traditional and typical in the sense of what he wanted for me: good grades, great education, respectable, high-paying job like a doctor or lawyer. But I also had my mom, who she was an artist that traveled all over the world and pursued a degree at Parsons for fashion design.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, though I struggled to meet the expectations of my father, but I was internally driven by this desire to pursue my passions. Both always existed hand in hand in my decision-making process. So when I majored in English Lit, I majored in it because I knew that was the subject I loved. But it was also one that I could go into law school or work for the UN, like my father wanted to. So I've always kind of carried those two with me. But when I got an offer to teach in the countryside of Korea from a mentor of mine right out of college, I think that's the moment, the pivotal moment where I really had to come to terms with disappointing my dad. Um, he had a really hard time understanding why I didn't go into like a high-end institute in Seoul. But what he didn't know at the time is that in rural Korea, I got to be part of designing an entire English program from the ground up for 500 students. I was thrown headfirst into responsibilities I wouldn't be able to experience until way later in a traditional career path.
Right.
And yeah, I was also part of an amazingly like close-knit community. So it was a time I got to discover my life calling. But it was also a time for me to reach back to my younger self and find that I was able to like find healing in providing things like safety and encouragement for my students. It was incredibly personal and healing, and that's not something that I think my father knew I needed. Um, so um, yeah, I did have to let go of the fact that he would not understand, but really felt like certain that this is what I needed to do. And eventually he did understand. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, all the work that you do is very meaningful, and I'm sure your father recognizes that now. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I would say like it took like he just said like a year ago that he now recognizes it. So it was a long time coming, but yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So we know you originally studied English and was an English teacher. Can you tell us a bit about your experiences as a teacher and what you're studying now in graduate school?
Before coming to grad school, I spent 5 years teaching in Oakland, California. I started in elementary, where you teach all the subjects, and ended up teaching middle school humanities. I came to Oakland after reading this book called Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson and during my teaching credential program. And it's the first time I was educated around like the horrifying truths about our criminal justice system here in America and how it so easily and wrongfully condemns African Americans who can't afford proper legal representation. There was a specific story about a 13-year-old boy who was wrongfully convicted, like abused in jail. Then they let him go because it was a mistake and they took no responsibility for the harm that they've caused and like permanent damage that they've caused on his life. And I think that was a pivotal moment in my career where I like dedicated my practice to social justice. And that led me to Oakland, where I taught in communities that were majority Black and Latinx population. And being new in this space, I had to take time really understanding not only like the racial and cultural context of the communities that I serve, but also my own identity. I had to come to terms with my own racial identity and how being a person of color was a unique experience for me and also very different from the communities I've served.
Right.
Sorry for my dog. I also had to understand my biases, my privileges, and my triggers, and really understand my role in serving this particular community. So there was a lot of identity reflection involved in being a teacher in Oakland.
Right. And I'm sure you discovered also a part of your identity while teaching in Korea as well, developing the English curriculum. So yeah. Yeah. So what inspired you to actually continue working in education? I know you touched a bit on this already, but yeah.
Yeah, I think so. The starting point, and the why, I guess, was like understanding how healing and directly related teaching felt for my own growth, my own personal growth. And as I continued to get educated and experienced in the field, it was very easy to feel compassionate and upset at the reality of the education system in America and how there's a lot of systemic racism and a lot of marginalization. And so being able to understand my own power and ability to make an impact in a better way has constantly driven me to search for like opportunities for growth. And more specifically here at grad school it's a space where I really get to connect with people who are like-minded and have the resources to make that change happen.
That's great. So in a way, you would say teaching was a way that you discovered your own purpose and identity as well as helping others. So yeah, that's great. So specifically in terms of your Asian American background, did you encounter any hardships due to your Asian American identity?
Yeah, I would say as an Asian American growing up, there was limited representation, which meant there was a plethora of stereotypes and prejudgments, right? So I wasn't able to see myself in leadership positions. I never spoke up. I was conflict averse. I felt like I had to be perfect in every situation. Beliefs like these came from my own culture and as a response to being a minority. And I had to unlearn many of these to allow myself to grow and give myself permission to be powerful. I feel
Right.
like Asian American woman, the concept of power was almost always taught to me in a negative way,
Mhm.
or as a negative trait. And so that was another just like unlearning that I had to do. So those are some examples of that.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. So now let's move into who you are today, the am of who you are. Can you tell us a bit about your work today?
Yeah, so I would say the work that I do today is, well, I'm studying currently, but a lot of what I'm studying is to deepen my practice around trauma-informed practices. I mentioned a little bit earlier as I was teaching in Oakland, I think it was really heartbreaking to see the reality of how many Black and Brown children are continued to be pushed out of the school system and into the criminal justice system. And large part of systemic issues and historical issues of poverty and injustices that have happened within their community. So working to support schools in integrating curriculum, support schools in integrating trauma-informed practices to combat this cycle of keeping those who are suffering in poverty within poverty. And really interested in something called culturally relevant pedagogy, which is changing the traditional structure of I guess the way history is taught in classrooms, or any lessons are taught in classroom that center whiteness as the mainstream culture, and including more voices of people of color, and specifically the people of that specific community, is something I'm very passionate about.
Yeah, and I really believe that that's something we need in this world today. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So would you like to also talk briefly about the specific program you're in at Harvard?
Sure. So it's a mouthful. We're going to talk about it, but it's called ELOE. It stands for Education, Leadership, Organizations, and Entrepreneurship. So there's a different education programs. This one is specifically geared towards education in the business and entrepreneurship space. So if you think about programs like Sesame Street or the International Rescue Committee, there's all these different spaces that are education focused, but not necessarily school based. And there's a lot of, I think, transferable knowledge and skills for someone like me who has only worked within schools to come into the space and really offer insight into how users or whatever the product is for a company, how that might land and how that might play out on a day-to-day. So that's my program, and it's part of the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
Yeah, that sounds like a really meaningful and unique program. So thank you. And next, has your perception of education and teaching in general changed after you entered graduate school?
It definitely expanded. The great thing about coming to grad school after having work experience is that you get to build on your knowledge out in the field. So I knew that America's education system was inherently racist, but now I have a better understanding of what that looks like in real life, like all the nitty-gritty things. Like, for example, in the 1920s, it was a time where there were a lot of Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were concerned about the influx of non-whites coming into the public schools and all the immigrants coming. So they proposed a series of tests based on idea that some ethnicities had a higher IQ than others. And they proposed this test to create a barrier to keep non-white students out of higher education. This is known as the SAT, right? And the idea of racial superiority obviously has been dismantled even by the APA, the American Psychology Association, but we still use the SAT as the main forms of competency around a higher education. And so that's just an example of how it really motivates me to continue learning how to dismantle work that's so historically rooted in our country.
Right. And there's still a lot of debates about actually what would be the best method to, measure students or how to accept students. And there's so many metrics, but there's also a lot of factors that play into, contributing to the inequities that are continuing to today. So, yeah. So next, would you like to share about any difficulties that you've faced in your career so far, specifically also as an Asian American, if any?
Yeah, I think I found it challenging to really understand what my role and impact could be in a space where I was a person of color, but had a much more safe and privileged experience compared to the communities of color that I served. And this uncertainty built onto like beliefs or practices around not speaking up, keep my personal thoughts to myself. It had me in a very passive role when it came to leadership and system impact for a long time. And so that was or I would say a challenge that I faced in my career.
Right. And I think a lot of people kind of mistakenly think of the model minority myth when thinking about Asians, and just saying that, oh, the stereotypes for Asians are actually all positive, but that's not really true. And they do actually harm us in different ways. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. And also, we were just wondering, do you have any memorable moments that you remember specifically while working as a teacher you'd like to share about?
Yeah, I think as a teacher, that's something you're never in shortage of. You're like every day is filled with memorable moments, but one that I would love to share is during my third year teaching in Oakland, we have like a morning routine when the like classroom comes in, like the students trickle in for the day, and it's really important for me to set the tone. I place a lot of focus and intention around how we start our mornings. So when students walk in, there's an activity for them on their desk. They can put their things up, grab breakfast from the counter, and eat it while they do the activity. I have calm instrumentals playing the whole time. Once they're done with breakfast, they can do a couple of things. They have a couple options. So they can, at that time, they were able to do capoeira, which is like a Brazilian martial arts practice with like our music teacher in the back of the class. We had like a breakfast cleanup crew and like different classroom jobs that happened in the morning, or they could read silently or continue to like work at their desk. And I remember just looking up from my desk at that in that morning, and the only time I spoke is when I greeted them at the door, and then I went back to my seat and I started just preparing for the day, and I looked up and it was just this beautiful harmony of students and community with each other doing different activities that felt good to them. And I will always remember like those mornings felt so sacred and so wonderful to me.
Yeah, that sounds like a great experience.
Mhm.
So, yeah. And I also love working with children and teaching other students. So, yeah, it's a really great experience. So next, as an Asian American in the field of humanities and education, what do you think the cultural perceptions of those that pursue humanities are in general?
I think cultural perceptions, to be honest, I view that as being entirely in my hands and in any individual's hands, especially now when there's been more Asian American representation in mainstream media than ever before. So when I show up, I hope to show my students and those I work with that identity is a place for exploration and can look like so many different things. I want to be academically oriented and fun. I want to be knowledgeable while being in a learner stance. I want to be a lot of different things at once because people are that. They can be that. And so
Right.
I think the humanities, it's a field based on this understanding that there's inherent value and worth in all individuals, right? And so to enter that as a Korean American means that I can continue to allow my students or encourage them to view their identity in spaces that can change and evolve as they like. That's what I think.
Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned that kind of shaping that cultural perception is kind of in our own hands. So how would you say that your academic journey has shaped you as a person, and what has it taught you?
Yeah, and I think my academic journey, much like my professional career, was very non-linear and non-traditional in the sense that I just moved around so much. And I went to 4 different elementary schools. That helped me see and provide the supports that my students needed in like making sure they feel like they belong and can contribute to a learning environment. My middle school experience, that was the first time I ever entered a majority white space, and I was the only Asian in most of my classes. And
Mhm.
that taught me that an environment can either support or discourage your view of self. So I work
Right.
really actively to provide inclusively, culturally relevant academic social experiences. And then my journey through higher education has taught me that so much of our growth involves the support of communities and intentional relationships. It's not like a solo journey, you know, and so I carry all these values from my academic journey in the ways I think about supporting my students and how I show up in my work.
Right. Thank you for sharing how your environment has also shaped you and the people around you. So, yeah. So in general, during this time, do you think, or how do you think the Asian American presence is influencing the field of education? Do you generally think there are more Asian Americans involved in the field of academia and humanities? Or yeah.
I can't speak on larger context just because I haven't looked into it. But in the spaces that I've been in the districts I've been in, I would say that the teachers, specifically humanities teachers that are Asian, is not as common.
Right.
And I can attribute that to possibly just like either the status or the pay of a teacher role isn't usually what's popular in Asian communities. But I also believe that Asians are more a part of this. There's more of a call, especially with this past COVID pandemic event and like the violence against Asians. There's a call for Asians now more than ever to really speak up um, in like the social justice conversations and really act on in like against the mono minority myth and really speak up for their needs and speak up on who they really are. So I think those are all factors at play that we can really use to rally more Asian Americans into the humanities sector.
Right. And I definitely think that is something that we could work on and is happening. So, yeah. So finally, we'll finish up with who you want to be in the future or will be in the future. There have been many things that you have accomplished so far, but 10 years from now, what is something new that you see yourself potentially doing?
That's a question I almost have to answer every day at school. So something that I definitely see myself doing is influencing the implementation of culturally relevant curriculum within schools that are also that also coach teachers around trauma-informed practices. So whether that's a director of schools where I'm working for a specific curriculum company and then I'm partnering with different schools and helping them implement that into their classrooms. Or I would really love to be in spaces of teacher coaching and coaching around how to best support their students and create a classroom culture that is academically rigorous and also very safe and nurturing. So those are some things that I would love to continue doing.
Thank you so much. So now we just have a couple questions from our members that I'd like to share. So first, we have a question from Summer, OurKFE member from Russia, and she wants to know if you have any advice for students wishing to pursue a path down education and the humanities.
Yes, I would say be very comfortable in like the pursuit and search of why you're doing something. I think your why and why you want to go into education and thinking about the impact you want to make is really important and will you carry you through. This is like a long game. Education is a long game and teaching is a long game. When you're investing in students, it takes
Right.
to see the fruit of your work. So what's really going to carry you through to the end is understanding your own why of why you want to do this and what kind of impact you want to make.
Right. I can see that just through your accomplishments that your own self-motivation has really carried yourself through a lot of your experiences. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And then finally, we have a question from Anjal, who's a member from India, and she wants to know, do you know what your parents expected you to be when you were younger, or did they ever talk about like, oh, I kind of would prefer you to go into this field? Any sort of that experience?
100%. I think I think so much of my turmoil around becoming a teacher and even like the delay of it was because of that, like the parental expectations around they thought I could be like a lawyer or, like really have like a high-end government job because they could see that I like to talk. So they were really pushing me in those directions. But again, I think when you know what's best for you, it's best for everybody and you act on it, right? It ends up being the best thing for everybody. For me, like disappointing my dad momentarily, and momentarily I mean for several years, um, ended up being like the best thing for our relationship because I really came to like a place of healing and understanding that extended into our relationship. And it was the best use of my privileges that he afforded me and being able to make an impact on a larger scale. So I really truly am a believer that if you act on things that are in line with your truths and your beliefs, that it will be a momentary disappointment that you can come to terms with, like let go and understand it's okay to disappoint your parents. And one day they will, as you will, see that it all worked out for the best.
Right. Thank you for that. And so basically, once again, I guess self-motivation and your own desire to kind of pursue your own path is really the key in succeeding, both with your parents and also for your own path down the humanities. So yeah, thank you
People
so much once. Oh,
disappointing people.
right. Yeah. So thank you so much once again for coming for the interview, and to everyone who's watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Was and Will.
Thank you for having me.